For my second section assignment, I've put together a digital story about the reforms in the 1930s. Reform in the 1930s was a continuation of the progressive ideals of the earlier decades, carrying with it many of the same ideas that we saw during the tenure of President Wilson and also of President Hoover. It was a continuation of the progressive ideals of optimism, of orchestrated societal growth, a belief in the U.S. government, and also as it continued to deal with the Industrial Revolution. Compared with the reform in the 1910s, the reform that took place in the 1930s was more pragmatic and less idealistic. There was a lot less of a moral imperative like the prohibition movement. We see in 1933, for example, the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which ends prohibition. The focus of the reforms was also more inwards, reining in the expansionist views of Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and continuing the isolationist movements of the 1920s. Comparing reforms in the 1920s and 1930s can best be done by comparing the two first ladies of the time. Reforms in the 1930s were more overt compared to the 1920s. Lou Henry Hoover was an educated geologist. She did activist work like overseeing the Women's Committee of Stranded Americans, helping stranded American women that were in Europe at the start of World War I. She also worked with the Girl Scouts as its national president, which encouraged girls to go outdoors. Though she was a feminist, it was a mantle she never claimed. Eleanor Roosevelt had the same activist spirit and carried the label proudly. She inspected the homes of war workers, hospitals, mines, etc. She worked at the Office of Civil Defense. Later, she was even part of the UN delegation and played an integral role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very visible proponent of reform of her times. As with every decade, reforms in the 1930s was facing a different adversary in the form of the Great Depression. Dust bowls were ravaging Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. The economy had already been showing signs of contracting, but the stock market crash of 1929 crystallized the problems of the economy. Unemployment rose. From 1929 to 1932, the national income was in free fall, dropping from 82 million to 68 million in 1930 to its lowest point of 40 million in 1932. There was widespread homelessness, and Hoovervilles rose up all over the country. Reform in the 1930s brought about an increase in the role of the federal government. From the New Deal alphabet soup of organizations to the creation of Social Security, the federal government played a greater role in the lives of all Americans. In trying to stave off the Great Depression, the Roosevelt administration created jobs for millions. It employed thousands of men in the Civilian Conservation Corps, planting trees and maintaining parks. Construction work sponsored by the federal government boomed, and the WPA employed artists which gathered stories, created murals, and exposed their population to the theater. But as in every decade, the reforms were not without their failures. Many of the reforms did not reach minority populations. A black packing house worker in Chicago was only able to get a loan because a fellow union white brother would vouch for him. Also, despite the many job programs created by the government, the Depression still lingered. Incomes had started to rise but were still nowhere near the levels they were before the Depression. Even Social Security was a watered down version of what Roosevelt had originally wanted. It also provided aid to part of the population over 65. Some people, like Charles Fusco, an Italian munitions worker, thought it didn't go far enough. After all, people had to be at least 65 before they could get any of the money. The reforms in the 1930s built on the platform set in the 1910 and 1920s, and while it did a lot of work, it still left many things unfinished. Civil rights for blacks and other minorities would still have a long way to wait, but overall, the reforms in the 1930s had the greatest impact. Programs like Social Security are still with us to this day. The roads and bridges that were constructed allowed Americans to travel across the country. The Rural Electrification Administration spread electricity to rural areas. And Roosevelt increased the powers of the president and by extension the powers of the federal government, and the country has never managed to shrink back to an earlier form.